This afternoon, you will hear the story, the incredible story of when giants ruled the skies. First, let's take a look at the evolution of the airship. Well, in France, the Montgolfier brothers, 1783, balloons. 1909, a non-rigid airship, which we now call a blimp. Also in 1909, a semi-rigid, which would just give you a little bit more air or gas capacity. And then finally, or actually a little earlier, in 1906, was the rigid Zeppelin, multiple gas cells within an aluminum frame. And the man who invented this, the inventor was, of course, Count von Zeppelin. The first Zeppelin flight was in 1900, and the Count, in 1909, actually founded the first Zeppelin company. My wife and I have debated about finding another one, but we put that off. By 1914, he had made 1,588 flights carrying over 10,000 paying passengers. This is before World War I. Now here's the interior of a Zeppelin, which is an immense interior. I'll have some other shots to give you a scale in a minute. This is before the gas cells were actually installed. So here are your airship types. You have the Zeppelin, the rigid ship with multiple bags. You have a blimp, which is a non-rigid ship, and the gas fills out that bag. And then you have a semi-rigid, which is something in between. German Zeppelin passengers, how'd you like to stand up while you're flying? They were standing up for these short flights. During World War I, the Zeppelins that the German bombers had were 518 feet long, 52 mile an hour. They targeted London and Paris. There were 51 raids on England. 84 Zeppelins were built, 60 were shot down by the British. 5,800 bombs dropped in London, 557 people were killed. Another 1,300 injured. The picture you see here is in June of 1915. It was one of the first Zeppelins that actually was shot down. At first, the ack-ack guns couldn't reach the height, and the airplanes, the biplanes, couldn't fly that high. Then they modified it, and of course, when you're flying something filled with hydrogen, good luck. Though you had to have the right kind of bullet to ignite the hydrogen. There's the Zeppelin shoot down. After the war, everybody wanted a Zeppelin. So we have Italian Zeppelins. In fact, that Italian Zeppelin flew over the North Pole. Norway, Russia, England. England built a giant Zeppelin. It was part of German reparations, and including the US got Zeppelins, which we'll talk about in a minute. The Britain R-101 was launched on its first flight in October of 1929. It was 767 feet long, 180 feet in diameter. It was way, way overweight. You'll see the interior in a minute. Very underpowered. Its height was only 1,200 feet off the ground. But all the Zeppelins actually flew at very low levels. The official, on its maiden voyage, the British official said it was safe as a house. October 1930, all day the barometer had been falling, thunderstorms were moving in, and it was going to fly over the channel to France. Well, here are some of the brave victims, passengers. There were 6 passengers, 6 officers, 42 crew, and they began flying at a ground level of only 900 feet over France. And during this, the dirigible started rolling and dipping in the rain. It was very unstable. October 5th, that's what happened. It pancaked along the ground for about 60 feet. Then there was a terrific blinding explosion. 5,500 feet, 5,500,000 cubic feet of hydrogen blew up. 48 people died. It was the end of British Zeppelins, at least filled with hydrogen. There's the wreckage from the explosion. Now, in 1926, restrictions were lifted on Zeppelin construction for Germany. And in 1928, on September 18th, the Graf Zeppelin was born. 776 feet in length, 100 feet in diameter. Maximum speed, 79 miles an hour. Cruising at about 1,600 feet. And it could get up to 6,000 feet at its highest, and then the gas would start to deteriorate. Dr. Hugo Ecker was the commander, and he named it in honor of Count von Zeppelin. Count von Zeppelin was born in Ulm, Germany, which is about 100 miles north of Switzerland. Albert Einstein was born in Ulm. Erwin Rommel was born in Ulm. And a professor of mine, Hans Schieser, was born in Ulm. But I'll talk about him in a minute. Inside, here is, first of all, there is the Graf Zeppelin older Friedrichshafen. So you get an idea of the size of that, and you'll get a better shot of the hangars in just a moment. Here's the Graf Zeppelin landing. Now, I want you to note the size of the people next to the Hindenburg, to the Graf Zeppelin. That gives you a really good scale. Sort of like standing next to an ocean liner, except this was as big as or bigger than most ocean liners. Here's a ticket, passenger ticket on the Zeppelin. What was it like to fly on the Graf Zeppelin? Well, first of all, it was very memorable. You were floating on air, no noise. The price in 1936 was $355. That would be equivalent to $5,800 today to get a ticket on the Zeppelin. Here are the passengers. 13,000 paying passengers would fly on the Graf Zeppelin on 590 flights, and they had 36 crew members. The Graf Zeppelin never crashed. Well, now here is the interior. I'll point out just a few. The dining room. Here are the passenger rooms, the dining room, the kitchens and stuff. Now this was inside. Here are the control room in the front, all right, or the crew control. And here is the actual. This was in the control car underneath the Zeppelin. The Hindenburg would be inside the body of the Zeppelin. Here's the passenger corridor. Well, on boarding, the stewards would immediately confiscate any matches you had. That's right, and dogs too. Passengers were then escorted to their cabins. The cabins were for 20 people, sleeping berths. Each had heat, light, ventilation, a push-call button for the steward. You get your shoes shined like on a Pullman train. The bunk beds folded up into a couch during the day. Here's the luxurious women's washroom in a separate area. And here's the lounge. After unpacking, the travelers would congregate in the lounge because as they pulled out of the hangar, they get to see then the gradual lift. Picture here is the chef and steward, 8 a.m. breakfast, noon lunch, tea and coffee from 4 to 5, 7 to 8 dinner. They could watch the ocean liners as they passed them because they were going twice the speed of an ocean liner. Write postcards, play chess and cards. They had a sweepstakes as to how many miles they would fly in a day. Here's the kitchen where they provided gourmet meals and European cuisine. The Zeppelin itself carried 4 million cubic feet of hydrogen. All right? And there's the, oops, let's just go back. There's the control room. Here's a close-up of one of the Zeppelin motors. There were 5 motors in the, and they could obviously control the speed to some degree. Here are people tuning up the motor in Friedrichshafen. And now here's the interior. The gas bag installation, there's an empty water ballast bag. I'll show you, here's the ballast bag right here. Notice all the wires that are in the interior of this. That's very important. And if you were a crew member, here they are repairing the Zeppelin in flight. So they're actually probably over the ocean doing this. This is ballast. So in order to rise, they'd let water out so the ship would get lighter. Well, they did an around-the-world voyage in 1929, and who financed that? Well, who would you believe? William Randolph Hearst. And he had a woman reporter on the Zeppelin at all times. She was the first woman to fly around the world. The cost was, at this point, for the world trip was anywhere. The world trip was $50,000 if you actually wanted to take this cruise. August 1st, they left to Germany, but they had to fly, as you see this dotted line. Hearst wanted them to fly around the world. First, they had to fly to Lakehurst, and then they started going around the world. So first, they flew from Friedrichshafen to Lakehurst. Then they reversed course and flew back to Europe. They crossed Russia. They did not stop in Moscow. There was a rainstorm, but they crossed Siberia and the Ural Mountains. And then they reached the Pacific and landed on the 19th of August in Japan. And they stayed there to the 23rd. Part of Zeppelin mania was that almost every major country in the world issued Zeppelin stamps. These are Russian Zeppelin stamps. I collect stamps for 50 years. I shouldn't tell you how old I am. And I have some Zeppelin stamps like this in my collection. Here is, on the 26th, it arrived in LA. There was a shortage of hydrogen, so they were required to stay for a while, and they also had to replace several crew members. On the 27th, they left LA. They could not fly over the Rocky Mountains because of the updrafts and downdrafts. I don't know why this is not working right, but all right. So they flew instead on the southern route. They flew instead on a southern route, and hopefully, they flew through this pass, because they went to Texas, so they probably came through the San Gorgonio Pass here on their way to Texas. They landed in they left on the LA, and on the 29th of August, they left on the 27th. 2 days later, they landed in Lakehurst, New Jersey. And then the total flight was 12 days around the world, 20,373 miles. Then they had a New York ticker tape parade, and Eicher was given a gold medal by the National Geographic Society. In 1931, they did an Arctic voyage from Friedrichshafen first to Leningrad, and then they departed for the Arctic. The Graf Zeppelin landed or rendezvoused with this Russian trawler in the Arctic, and on the 31st, they were back in Germany. They started voyages on March 20th, 1932 to Brazil. 5,000 miles, the world's longest transatlantic air route. The $350 price of a ticket would be worth today around $5,600 to fly on this. It took about 3 days for the Zepp to fly that route, 14 days by ship. So I think you can see the advantage. This, because the Pan Am Clipper had not yet been invented in terms of long-distance flights. There was no competition. Here they are on the ground at Recife in Brazil. You'll notice there's no hangar because the weather is very mild there. After refueling, they went to Rio de Janeiro. And a regular hangar was built in Rio by 1935. The Graf Zeppelin made 66 round trips between Germany and South America between 1932 and 1937 without incident. Now, the Germans convinced the U.S. Postal Service to issue these 3 Zeppelin stamps. $4.55 in their day. Today, if you wanted to buy them, they're worth about $1,500. I'm a stamp collector, so I know something about this. 20 countries by that point had issued 225 Zeppelin stamps all around the world. In 1933, they left Germany, flew to Rio, and then Miami, Akron, Ohio, and they came to Chicago. How many people here are from Chicago? Raise your hands. All right. This is the Century of Progress, 1933-34 along the lakefront. It's the only World's Fair that made a profit. That's why it ran for 2 years. And the Graf Zeppelin flew over Chicago and the lakefront. And then it flew back to Germany. In fact, it went back to Akron on the 28th of October, and it then went to Seville, Spain on the 31st, and was back in Germany by the 1st of November. And here is the special stamp that the U.S. Post Office issued. It has on it this is the Federal Building in downtown Chicago at that time. That was torn down and replaced a long time ago. And here is the hangar in Friedrichshafen of the Graf Zeppelin. That 50-cent stamp, airmail, required 3 stamps put on the envelope. And that's how they also financed the Zeppelin flights, because people would buy those stamps like a first-day cover, and that's how they financed it. In total, the Graf Zeppelin made 590 flights, flew over 1 million miles, and carried 13,000 paying passengers. It was disassembled in 1939 because of the war. Now, how many of you remember Beatlemania? Hey, well, here is this, Zeppelin Mania. Look at that. Wow. They had everything. They had Zeppelin dresses, Zeppelin watches. In fact, that Zeppelin watch, we just saw it in the paper the other day. They brought it back. Zeppelin lady singers on Broadway. There was a Maybach modeled after the Zeppelin, Zeppelin harmonicas, a Zeppelin toy, a Zeppelin train. Now, and a Zeppelin diner. And Mussolini had a golden Zeppelin built for himself. He was so infatuated with the Zeppelins. And here's a composite photo, because what they intended to do was have the Zeppelin land in New York City at the top of the Empire State Building and have the people deplane there. And then they built something called the Furniture Mart, which is a huge, gigantic showroom, multi-story building with a big flat roof. They put this tower with an elevator, and they were going to have the Graf Zeppelin land there, and people come down the elevator. Guess what? They never did it. Why? Too windy. It would not, they couldn't control it. They needed to be on the ground. They could not do it up in the air. Well, now let's turn to the U.S. Zeps. Here is the first one. It was built in Lakehurst, New Jersey. It was the Shenandoah. The Shenandoah, Indian name, means daughter of the stars. It used helium. 680 feet long, 5,000-mile range, 70-mile speed. Huge hangar was built at Lakehurst, and in 1924, it took a flight across the United States to California and Washington State. Now, this was run by the U.S. Navy. This was war reparations from Germany. It was meant as a potential machine for the U.S. Navy to use in war. So they wanted to experiment with it. So what did they do? They kept flying them into thunderstorms. Well, here's what happened. The Shenandoah crashed in 1929. It was caught in a storm. It blew all the way up to 3,600 feet, and then it was dropped. Big wind came up, snapped the hull, the stern floated to the earth, the bow rose, and then floated to a safe landing. 18 men were in the stern section. There's the crash. That's what it looked like. Here is the bow with the 7 men. After the crash, the Zeppelins the frame was strengthened, motors, they increased the power of the motors, and they paid more attention to the weather, supposedly. Well, here now is something right in your backyard. How many of you have seen that big hangar along Interstate 5, right between San Diego and LA. And it was built for this baby. It was called the LZ-126. It was part of war reparations with Germany. The Zeppelin was turned over to the U.S. It was now the U.S. Goodyear and Zeppelin Company, so they formed an alliance. October 15th, it arrived in Lakehurst, New Jersey, and it was renamed the USS Los Angeles. 658 feet in length, 91-foot diameter, 5 motors, 400 horsepower per motor, 2.7 million cubic feet of helium. Here's the Los Angeles in flight. It flew 200,000 miles across the U.S. to the Panama Canal, Costa Rica, and Bermuda. But here's what the wind can do to a Zeppelin. October 27, 1927, while tethered at Lakehurst, New Jersey, a gust of wind caught the tail and cold air above caused the ship to rise 85-foot angle before it came back down again. Now, the U.S. Navy had it actually tethering with a tender, aircraft tender, the Paducah, several times, and another ship, the USS Akron, also, this is a picture of it, also being tethered to be used with the fleet. Now, this is a telling perspective, because here now you have the Shenandoah and the Los Angeles side by side. I want you to take a look at the people on the bottom. Again, it gives you a perspective of the immensity of these aircraft. The largest U.S. Zep was the USS Macon, launched in September of 1931. It was 785 feet, had a height of 146, and had 6.5 million cubic feet of helium in it. It had 8 500 horsepower engines. It had a maximum speed of 85 miles and a range of 9,200 miles. And it had 8 3-caliber machine guns mounted to it. Because remember, these are naval vessels, guys. Here's the crew of the Macon. And the Macon was an aircraft carrier. They had on it a hook by which a ship, a plane, could hook itself on, and then the fighter would be brought back inside. Here's a picture of how that looked. The Akron is the other ship. It flew over its hangar in Akron, Ohio, which is still there. It's a National Historic Site. When I was in Akron, I had the opportunity to go inside that hangar. It's bigger than you would believe. In fact, it's so big, it has to have fans in the top because clouds would form and it would rain inside the hangar. That's how large this thing was. Now here's a seaman running the Akron. The wheel faced outboard parallel to the aircraft. It had a 785-foot axis so that the elevator man could readily detect and change the trim or correct for it. At eye level is a varimeter to measure the rate of rise or fall. Near the wheel is an altimeter, an elevator, a position indicator, an inclinometer, and other instruments. Here they are repairing the Akron. Now, the Akron had in it 6.6 million rivets in that frame. Remember, it has a rigid steel frame. It made 73 flights, flew 1,700 hours. Now, I want you again to pay particular attention. Particular attention to all these wires inside this that helped that frame to remain rigid, all right? It crashed in New Jersey in a severe storm. Again, the Navy was trying to test this as a reliable vessel that could fly with the fleet. So every time there was a storm over the fleet, they didn't want the Shenandoah and the others to disappear. Well, it didn't work. In fact, all of our 4 dirigibles, all of them crashed. Let's go back to Germany. Here's Hugo Echner. You saw him before. In 1930s, he was the president of the Zeppelin company, and he was going to build the largest Zeppelin ever. And here it is, the Hindenburg. Now, I want you to take a look at the Boeing, the Hindenburg. There's a blimp. Here's the Queen Mary, or here's the Titanic, all right? Almost 800 feet long. In fact, it was 804 feet long. That's a city block. In Chicago, a block is 800 feet long. It's a city block. It was 135 feet high. It had 7 million cubic feet of hydrogen. It could get up to 84 miles per hour. It had 4 engines, each of 4,200 horsepower. It had a crew of 40. It could carry 72 people. It flew 191,000 miles, and it carried over 2,800 passengers. Its range was 8,750 miles. This was truly a spectacular airship. And of course, as you may notice, it's blocked out, but those are swastikas that the Nazis put on it. Once Hitler came to power, they used it. Now here are the Hindenburg and Graf Zeppelin flying over Friedrichshafen. My friend Hans was 5 years old when that flew over Ulm. He wanted to be a Zeppelin captain when he was a little boy. Now you get an idea of the size of the Hindenburg next to that hangar that they're storing it in. So the brochure to cross the North Atlantic on the Queen Mary took 5 days. On the Hindenburg, it was 2.5 to 3 days. The Queen Mary price was $93 to $663 per person, which would be $1,500 to $11,000. The price of the Hindenburg was one fare, $6,800. So this was not for the poor, I'm afraid. Now here are the 2 decks. There are 2 decks on this ship. The deck B contained the passenger rooms, it contained the smoking, well, no, I'm sorry, this is deck A. All right. This contained, there, the passenger rooms. This is the lounge. Over here is the dining room. All right. There's deck B. Deck B had in it the smoking room. Oops, just a second. Right, there we go. Here's the smoking room, which we'll talk about in a minute. And it had crew quarters. And it had, this is how they got into the ship, the passenger boarding area. Showers, kitchens, etc., urinals, toilets, etc. In the lounge was a map of Columbus's voyage. It showed a track of ocean liners across the North Atlantic, and it had a 350-pound grand piano made out of aluminum. And here's the observation windows where the passengers could look at the landing as well as the takeoffs, and of course at the ships. And this is going to be very important, a very important place on the last flight. You'll see why in a minute. The dining room was 47 feet length, 13 feet wide, had paintings on silk wallpaper depicting scenes from the Graf Zeppelin's flights to South America, and it had charts of their flight and carried lightweight aluminum chairs and tables. Passenger quarters, call buttons, small fold-down desk, wash basin, small closet, a toilet and shower on B deck. All passenger areas were heated. At one point, the Zeppelins weren't heated, so this was a big thing for them. 25 double cabins for 50 passengers, and then they added 9 more cabins, 20 more passengers. Here's some of the decorations of the writing room, decorated with paintings of scenes from around the world. And believe it or not, people actually wrote postcards and letters. Isn't that amazing in those days? The smoking room. Now, how could you have a smoking room? They did. The smoking room was kept at a higher ambient pressure so that no leaking hydrogen could enter the room. It was separated by a double door airlock. There was one electric lighter to light all the cigarettes that stayed in the room. And they monitored the passengers. No one could leave with a burning cigar, cigarette, pipe, or anything else. And here's the control car. Now, this is on the bottom of the ship itself. And of course, this is the flag. Now, you can see the influence of the Nazis, which was unfortunate. And now we come, and there's the Nazi medal. And now we'll talk about what everyone always wants to hear about, the disaster. But again, I want to emphasize to you, the Graf Zeppelin never had a disaster. All right? Well, here they are circling Manhattan on that fateful day, May the 6th. They're waiting for an electrical thunderstorm to clear over Lakehurst, New Jersey. They're 200 feet, and this is how they landed it. They threw down landing ropes and helped to pull it down. At 7:21 p.m., a fine drizzle, a reddish glow, appeared near the stern, and then a bomb explosion. There you go. It raced, the sound and the flame raced through the entire ship. So that, oops, let's go back. There we go. It enveloped it, it buckled in the center, and look at the flame coming out its nose. Then the entire ship crashed to the ground. 35 seconds from when the explosion was heard till it was a flaming ruin on the ground. What a minute before had been an international technical marvel, now was a deathbed of ashes, and the fire continued to burn for hours. Yeah. 62 people survived. Now you're going to say, how did they survive? 36 died, 13 passengers, 22 crew, and 1 ground crew that was pulling the ropes down. So how did they survive? Well, here it is. The passengers were in that lounge waiting to deplane. See where the windows were? The windows could be opened, they jumped. They were almost on the ground. Second, remember I showed you that water ballast? That bag broke. They were drenched in water. Tons of water. So that's how many of them escaped with minor burns. They had burns. The captain was literally burned alive. He survived, but he died shortly thereafter. What caused the explosion? I'm sorry, even though George C. Scott is a wonderful actor, if you saw the movie Hindenburg, I'm going to reveal to you now what they have finally figured out. Remember I told you about all of those wires in the Hindenburg. One of them broke, and the wire cut and made a small cut in a gas bag, allowing the hydrogen to escape. There was static electricity in the air. Boom. Hydrogen and oxygen, explosive. So that is what caused the disaster. Here is singed mail. And again, they made a lot of money carrying mail back and forth. I have a genuine facsimile of this in my stamp collection because they're very expensive. There are not many pieces of the real mail, but there's some of them. Well, now let me explain something to you. Here's hydrogen and helium. Actually, the lift power between the two is almost the same. Some people say, oh, it's much better with hydrogen. That's not true. The difference is this. Helium is non-explosive. Why didn't the Germans use helium? I'll tell you why. They didn't have it. We had it. Near Amarillo, Texas, is a huge underground pool, of helium. It's a natural element. You cannot make helium. And you can also recycle it and repurify it and use it over and over and over again. Now, hydrogen can be manufactured, and it's cheap. That's why most people used hydrogen. Now, there are other sources today of helium in other countries around the world, but we do have a shortage of helium. Now, the Germans immediately built another Hindenburg. Here it is. In fact, they called it the Graf Zeppelin II. Same size as the Hindenburg. And the United States agreed to sell Germany helium because they felt very badly that this accident had occurred in the US. And they were going to allow passenger traffic between these countries. Well, the Graf Zeppelin II that you see here, with the Nazi emblems on it, flew 30 times, but it never had any passengers. And Germany, because of what it was doing even before the war, the Holocaust had begun with Kristallnacht, the United States took back its agreement to sell them helium. So they had to use hydrogen again. No paying passengers ever flew on Graf Zeppelin II. The Germans, however, did put, if you can see, these crazies, they had some machine guns on the top of this. I have news for you, it never flew. However, they do believe there is some evidence that the Graf Zeppelin II was used in reconnaissance missions over the coast of England before the war. But both the Hindenburg and the Graf Zeppelin were disassembled in 1939, and its aluminum frame and parts were used for the war. All right, now let's move on to U.S. Navy blimps. Okay, all you Navy guys in the audience, wake up now. During World War II, the United States had a fleet of these blimps. The Phoenix that rose from the ashes of the Hindenburg blimp. It's a cigar-shaped balloon that fills out when expanded with helium. Now, here is an idea. Here is, you can see here, there's a blimp, and here are the big ships. You get an idea of the comparisons. Or better yet, that's a hangar for the USS Los Angeles with a blimp in it. Looks like a toy next to, doesn't it? However, Goodyear, this hardy little ship, never exceeded 385 feet in length, but Goodyear had an entire fleet in operation in the 1930s. All over the United States, people flew on blimps. During 14 years, Goodyear passenger blimps operated across the U.S. They used a bus that was the portable mast, and for landing, and a mobile repair shop. Across the U.S., Goodyear blimps carried 400,000 passengers. This is when regular airplanes were in its infancy. They were so reliable that a trip in one was without a bump, devoid of excitement, and like riding aboard a commuter train. And that is a message from the PR company of Goodyear. They didn't carry as many as a dirigible would. And during World War II, the United States Navy deployed over 200 blimps across the North Atlantic and along the Atlantic seaboard, North and South America. They were effective against German submarines, and they did transatlantic convoy duty against submarines. This pictures an M3 blimp. It carried 8 depth charges, radar, Browning machine guns, and its anti-submarine weapons were very effective. Why? Because to shoot a torpedo, a submarine had to come up to periscope depth. They could see it. So those Jeep carriers, a Jeep carrier was a small aircraft carrier that the Navy built. Many of them were just merchant ships with a flight deck on them. And besides the aircraft, they could keep the blimp up for long periods of time. And it really, really stopped the German U-boat war. It was essential. It was one of the key elements, not the only thing. During convoy duty across the Atlantic and along North and South America, U.S. Navy blimps escorted thousands and thousands of merchant ships. And according to one source, supposedly without the loss of a single ship, though I find that hard to believe. Today we still have blimps, the Goodyear blimp, the Fuji blimp. I've seen it here going through the pass. And now there's a big interest all of a sudden in balloons. They've been in the news lately, haven't they? Well, the Japanese floated all those balloons, thousands of them. Some of them were filled with antitoxins that luckily froze before they hit the ground in the Pacific Northwest. And they set many fires during World War II. In fact, there was a whole unit of Air Force paratroops or Army paratroops that were used to put those fires out. Well, now, here is an observation balloon, a dirigible, that during the Reagan administration they wanted to build. And why didn't we do that? Well, if you turn, all of you just turn your heads and look toward the back and the ceiling. You see what we have there. What is it? A drone, yes. It's a lot cheaper and easier to use than these things, isn't it? So that stopped it. However, there have been proposals for airships to freight hauling to remote areas that have never quite happened, but there are many proposals for it. And now here is, you can have a Zeppelin experience, and a friend of mine, who will please stand up here, he flew in a Zeppelin here on the Atlantic coast, and he lives, though it was filled with helium. This is, you see in the picture, here, this is Friedrichshafen. That is the Zeppelin Museum, which is filled with artifacts and a mock-up of the Hindenburg. So they fly these over Lake Constance, which is Lake Zurich on the other side. I was there. Unfortunately, it was raining that day, so they didn't fly, and they wanted $350 for a 1-hour ride. And these carry 12 passengers, and 2 crew. Here is the Zeppelin Museum. This, again, is right on the border between Germany and Switzerland. Inside the museum are displays of all these different Zeppelins. And most interesting, a full-scale mock-up of parts of the Hindenburg. There's the ramp to go in. There's an intrepid tourist going up, like I did. And my wife Elaine is here. We did this together. And there is the full-scale mock-up of which we just saw. That is the lounge of the Hindenburg as it looked before it crashed. And also we could see the passenger compartments, the sleeping compartments. Those 2 areas they showed. There have been a lot of crazy ideas about, this is an atomic dirigible to be powered with an atomic reactor for the engines, never built. This is another high-tech KLM dirigible proposed, never built. This is another American huge whale of a dirigible. And the Russians had a nuclear, just to show you that we aren't the only crazy ones, they had a nuclear airliner that they proposed. That's on a dirigible, never built. Well, folks, when we talk about airships and Zeppelins, that's the image that you all see and remember. But you should remember this image, because they were successful, they were important. And with blimps, with Goodyear, they did transport Americans through a tremendous age of air travel. And on that note, I say to you, floating through the sky is still a fascinating experience, and I hope someday I have the opportunity to do it. Thank you very much.